The Widow's Liberation. A story of silent suffering, betrayal, and the unseen strength of a woman who reclaimed her life. For years, Emma lived in a world that wasn't her own. It belonged to her husband, Daniel, a man who had stolen her independence, her choices, and even her ability to dream. When he died, she was supposed to mourn. Instead, she exhaled for the first time in years. Daniel had been a master of illusion. To the world, he was a devoted husband and provider, but behind closed doors, he controlled every aspect of Emma's life. When she became pregnant, he convinced her to quit her job, promising to take care of her. But his idea of care was caging her in, making her ask permission for everything, even something as trivial as a bottle of lotion. What was hers was his. What was his was his. She had stayed at first out of love, then out of fear. By the time she realized she no longer loved him, he had already begun his first affair. He made her believe it was her fault, blaming her for not being intimate after the traumatic birth of their child, a birth that had left her needing stitches. That was when she began to plan her escape. With no job and no outside support, she started selling things from home, hiding away small amounts of money whenever she could. She knew she would need a lawyer. But Daniel was always watching, always controlling. When he started another affair, this time with a friend, a man, Emma felt nothing but relief. It kept him distracted. She pretended not to know, even when their betrayal unfolded right under her nose. She let them have their secrets while she crafted her own, her exit plan. But then fate intervened. Daniel died suddenly. And with his death, the world rewrote his story. The man who had manipulated, abused, and belittled her was now remembered as a devoted husband and loving father. Even those who had known of his infidelity, his cruelty, spoke only of his virtues. His family painted him as a man who had given everything to Emma and their child. At the funeral, his affair partner had the audacity to embrace her, whispering, "He truly loved you." The hypocrisy was suffocating, but Emma played her part. She cried. She wore the mask of the grieving widow because it was the only way to protect what was finally hers. Had he lived, he would have stolen everything from her in the divorce. Her home, her child, her freedom. He had promised as much, threatening her every time she showed even the smallest defiance. But now she had it all. The house. The financial security of a widow's pension. Most importantly, she had her children. She could breathe again. To the world, she was just a fragile widow trying to cope. In reality, she was stepping into her new life. She had enrolled in psychology courses, not to grieve but to understand, to heal, to rebuild herself from the ruins he had left behind. Then weeks later, the past came knocking. Daniel's affair partner, his so-called best friend, showed up at Emma's doorstep. One of her children let him in before she could stop it. He had read something online, a post she had written about her experiences, though she had never shared it on social media. Someone else must have. The man sat across from her, unease rippling in his posture. He wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here to offer closure. Instead, he spoke of Daniel as if he were some misunderstood hero, a man with flaws but a great friend nonetheless. He wanted her to let go of the past, to stop digging. His words, his insistence, sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up her spine. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt like she was back in his grip. The same intimidation, the same unspoken threat. He was afraid of the truth, afraid of what she might reveal. Emma had spent years shrinking under Daniel's shadow, but she wasn't that woman anymore. His death had done for her what she had been too afraid to do herself. She was free. And no ghost of the past, no lover clinging to secrets, no family painting Daniel as a saint, would ever take that away from her again. She had survived him. Now she would learn to truly live. For years, Emma had been silenced, forced into submission, a ghost in her own life. But now, standing in her own home, watching the man who had shared her husband's betrayal dare to tell her what to do, something inside her snapped. He had come with the same arrogance, the same control her husband once wielded. He, of all people, who had seen firsthand what Daniel had done to her, had the audacity to stand in her living room and tell her to be quiet, to move on, to pretend. As if she hadn't done that enough already. Her hand moved before she even thought about it. The punch landed squarely on his face, shocking them both. But Emma didn't regret it. If anything, it felt like she had just struck Daniel himself, the ghost of his control, the chains he had wrapped around her for years. "Get out," she growled, her voice steady, powerful. "Or I will tell everyone." He scrambled away, eyes wide with something that almost looked like fear. He had expected her to be the same woman she had always been, the one who nodded and obeyed, who swallowed her pain in silence. He had underestimated her. For days she replayed that moment in her head. The anger, the release, the finality of it all. She had spent so long letting others dictate her life. Never again. At first she had planned to remain silent, to let the past stay buried. But now she saw the truth. Staying silent was just another form of submission, another way for them to keep their power over her. If that man dared to come back, if he so much as tried to intimidate her again, she wouldn't hesitate to expose everything. The lies, the affairs, the abuse. She would scream it to the world if she had to. With the economic crisis looming, she knew she had to think ahead. Selling the house wasn't an option. No one could afford it right now. But renting it? That was an idea worth pursuing. If she could find a good job, she could save enough to rent another place for herself and her children while leasing this house for income. And maybe one day she would buy a small piece of land. Something that was truly hers. A place where no one could ever take her freedom again. Her children were adjusting little by little. They didn't speak much about their father, and she understood why. They had seen more than she had wanted them to. It had taken time, but she had finally found a child psychologist for them. They were going to their sessions now, slowly processing everything, and she was doing the same. Therapy wasn't just for healing, it was a path to rebuilding, to rediscovering the person she had lost along the way. One by one, she was closing the doors to the people who had once controlled her. She had started making excuses to avoid her own family, avoiding their judgment, their whispers about what a good man Daniel had been. She knew better now. And even her children, sensing her newfound strength, seemed lighter, happier. The only lingering shadow was Daniel's mother. She still visited from time to time, still clung to the illusion of her son's saintly memory. Emma tolerated it for now, but the visits were growing fewer, the ties fraying. Soon she would be free of them all. A message had once told her that the past could not be erased, but it could be rewritten. And Emma was doing just that. Not as a widow mourning a lost husband, but as a woman who had survived. Who had fought. Who had won. For the first time in years she was not afraid. She was free. Story 2. The woman who hugged like family, a daughter's fight to protect her mother. I couldn't explain it at first, just a gut feeling, a whisper of unease that tickled the back of my mind. My mother had a new friend, someone who had seemingly come out of nowhere, and every interaction with her left me feeling like I was watching a storm gather on the horizon. My mother, Anna, was 70, frail and on hospice care. She had been living in an independent senior complex for a few months, making casual acquaintances but mostly keeping to herself. Then one day there was Margaret. The first time I met her, my boys and I were visiting my mom when this woman strolled up alongside her. She had an air of belonging that felt strangely forced. When I extended my hand in greeting, she ignored it, wrapping me in an unexpected hug. "Oh, I only do hugs for family. And we're pretty much family now," she said with an overly sweet smile. Family? I had never even heard my mother mention her. My mom, for her part, just nodded and said Margaret had been a great friend. That was fine. I wanted my mother to have friends, but something about this woman's presence made my skin crawl. Then the little things started adding up. Margaret decided, seemingly out of nowhere, that she too would move into my mom's new apartment complex. Her unit wasn't ready yet, but she'd be there soon. She bought my mom's dog a sweatshirt that read "World's Best Auntie" for Christmas, after knowing her for 2 months. It was too much, too fast. Then Margaret called me, formally introducing herself, and casually slipped into conversation that she could manage my mother's medications for her. "I really appreciate the offer," I replied carefully, "but hospice prefers to limit who handles her medications, especially since they include controlled substances. It's best for you to focus on just being her friend." Hours later my mom called me, upset. Margaret had twisted my words, making it sound like I had called my own mother exhausting and didn't appreciate her help. When I confronted Margaret, she lied, claiming my mom had read our conversation in text messages, except our exchange had been over the phone. That was when I knew she was dangerous. Every time I spoke with my mother, I could hear Margaret whispering in the background, feeding her words, inserting herself into conversations. My mother didn't seem to notice. She just laughed, telling me I was overreacting. Then my mother started becoming confused. She sounded like she was over-medicated, except I was the only one dispensing her doses and everything was locked away. So I did what I had to. I took her credit and debit cards, making sure no one could take advantage of her. I had no proof, but I knew Margaret was waiting for an opening. When I called my mom's oldest friend for advice, I didn't tell her my suspicions. I simply asked if she had met Margaret. "I don't know why," she admitted hesitantly, "but I get a bad feeling about her. Like she's up to no good." Hearing that from someone else made me feel less crazy. But I still didn't know what Margaret's angle was. Then came moving day. I had installed cameras in my mother's new apartment with her permission. While I was out briefly testing the camera app on my phone, I caught a conversation between my mother and Margaret. Margaret was feeding my mother lines, subtly turning her against me, making her question my choices and my love for her. When I got back, I confronted my mother. I was crying, really genuinely hurt. "I do everything for you," I told her. "And to hear you talk about me like that, Mom, it hurts." She cried too. And finally she listened. She agreed to distance herself from Margaret and told her outright that talking about me negatively was unacceptable. Margaret, ever the performer, acted remorseful, blaming it all on a misunderstanding. But Margaret wasn't done. A week later, I called my mother and discovered that Margaret had taken her to the bank to get a new debit card. I saw red. That night, I sent Margaret a text. "Margaret, I know you took my mother to the bank today. I want to be very clear. You have no business getting involved in my mother's finances. I handle them. If you sincerely care about her, step back. Right now, you're dancing very close to elder abuse territory, and if you continue, I will not hesitate to involve the authorities." Margaret responded with a saccharine apology, claiming she just wanted to help and that we had gotten off on the wrong foot. I never replied. And just like that, she vanished. The silence was louder than any argument. Margaret was supposed to move into the complex, but she never did. She stopped reaching out to my mother, she had lost her angle. I took extra precautions, notifying my mother's hospice nurses, social worker, and bank. I even invested in a high-tech medication dispenser with app alerts and a passcode. I made sure Margaret had no way back in. Weeks passed and I realized something. My mother seemed happier. Without Margaret whispering poison in her ear, our conversations felt lighter. She had even made some real friends in her new building. Margaret never made another attempt to worm her way back in. Maybe she moved on to an easier target. Maybe she realized she had underestimated me. It didn't matter. Because my mother was safe. And I had one. Trusting your instincts can sometimes be the difference between safety and harm. When something feels off, it usually is. This story reminds us that not everyone who comes into our lives has good intentions, and when it comes to protecting our loved ones, we must always be vigilant. True kindness doesn't come with hidden motives, and real friendships are built on honesty, not manipulation. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't hesitate to set boundaries and take action. Protecting the people we love is never overreacting. It's an act of love. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life experiences and lessons that matter. Let's spread awareness and help each other navigate life's challenges.